If you said that the United States has one of the most stable and buoyant economies in the world, you'd be correct. But you wouldn't have always been correct. For a very long time after America gained its independence, the country battled with economic instability. Some people thought that having a central bank would help fix the problems and stabilize the economy, but others were worried about the whole economy being under the control of one body. Because of this, and a couple of other reasons, there were several failed attempts at establishing a central bank, and the American government probably considered scrapping the whole central bank idea for a while. However, after the financial crisis of 1907, the authorities decided to try to make a central bank work. So, between 1907 and 1913, a couple of the leading bankers and government representatives went on a world tour of central banks, and the result of that was the Federal Reserve System is created by the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. So, the Fed has existed for 120 years so far, and in all that time, its roles and powers have evolved. Its roles are hinged on two pillars, though controlling inflation and increasing employment. So technically, everything that the Fed does should result in either or both of those core outcomes. And considering how critical these two broad roles are, the Fed is now one of the most powerful forces in American society. As a part of its duty to control inflation, the Fed is responsible for managing the supply of money inside the economy. It determines how much money will be pumped into or pulled out of the American economy at any given time, and this is supposed to be done to stabilize the economy. Now, I should quickly mention that the Fed does not do the actual printing or minting of money. That's the duty of the Treasury, but the Fed does determine how many new bills will be printed. The singular fact that the Fed determines how much money is pumped into or pulled out of the economy emphasizes just how powerful it is. Consider that the power to create and discontinue money as the need it affects the economy's production and consumption. What this means is that every action that the Fed takes affects every single American, poor or rich. Its influence extends beyond the economy as a whole, to the everyday lives of Americans. But there is more. Remember that second pillar? Yeah, the Fed also has been saddled with the responsibility of reducing unemployment, and one of the ways that it does this is by controlling interest rates. Primarily, the control of interest rates is to help stabilize the economy by increasing or reducing money circulation. So, if interest rates are low, borrowing is cheaper, which means that people and organizations can get access to more money to spend. This could eventually lead to there being too much money in circulation, though at which point, the Fed would hike up the interest rates to discourage borrowing. However, generally when organizations have a lot of money to spend, one of the results should be more employment opportunities. And this is because the organizations have the funds to expand operations and pay new employees. So the Fed could drop interest rates as a way of increasing employment, but they wouldn't do it at the risk of devaluing the dollar due to overcirculation. Speaking of the dollar, the Federal Reserve is not just important for Americans, it is important for other nations around the world as well. The Fed provides foreign governments with currency reserves, allowing them to borrow money from the United States. This is an important power for the United States since it's one of the biggest global economies in the world and the dollar is practically the world's money. At this point, I feel like I should ask you what your impression of the Fed is. Do you think it is uncomfortably important to the American economy? Because if you do, I understand completely. They are in charge of how the money gets into the economy, how that money is circulated, and how citizens get money. After all, it feels like a lot of control for one body. But then again, what is the alternative? Anyway, if you don't think that the Fed has too much control over the American economy and the entire country in general, you would probably not be comfortable with the fact that it is completely independent. That is, whatever decisions and monetary policies it comes up with are made autonomously and do not need to be approved by the federal government. The Fed isn't exactly a part or branch of the government. Let's break this down. Three key entities make up the Federal Reserve System. You have the Board of Governors, the Federal Reserve Banks, and the Federal Open Market Committee. The Board of Governors is a federal government agency, and it is directly accountable for Congress, from which it derives its authority. This, however, does not mean that Congress needs to approve any of its decisions or that the board is funded by Congress. It does mean that the members of the board are appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate, and it also means that Congress sets the goals for monetary policy and the board has to submit an extensive report to Congress. However, the 12 Federal Reserve banks are private entities. They are controlled by the board, But that's the same as every other commercial bank in the country. This is why if you ask whether the Fed is private or government-owned, most people would say it is because technically it is both. And the government ownership doesn't have that much of a bearing on how things are run. Now, at this point, some people are probably really worried. The Fed could quite literally make or break the country, and yet, for the most part, it has been left to its own devices. But there are legit arguments for this independence, and the primary argument is that for the Fed to be effective in the long term, it cannot afford to be tethered to short-term politics and political sentiments. Every government comes in with its ideas of how things should be done, and with how sensitive the Fed's roles are. It can't afford to be malleable to the whims of different governments. Another argument is that autonomy allows the Fed to execute policies that it believes would be effective in the long run, even if they might be quite unpopular. After all, the board is supposed to be composed of economists and other financial experts, while anybody could be a politician. But some arguments oppose the complete independence of the Fed. The biggest opposition has to be the fact that some people consider it undemocratic. And that's because the members of the Board of Governors, which is an agency of the federal government, are not democratically elected. Also, the Fed is not accountable to the U.S. public, even though it dictates how the public's money is created, distributed, and even earned. Another argument that people have against independence is that it could result, and has resulted, in poor coordination between the country's fiscal policy and monetary policy. So, because the Fed doesn't take directions from Congress, Congress could be cutting taxes, which is a fiscal policy, while the Fed is increasing interest rates, which is a monetary policy. As a result, both agencies would be working against each other. Now, there is a completely different argument about the effectiveness of the Fed. With all the power that it has, many people are not convinced that it has been able to carry out its duties. And considering the current state of the economy and the rate of unemployment, you might agree with this as well. I'm interested in hearing what you have to say about this too. Do you think the Fed has been doing an excellent job, or has it proven ineffective? Feel free to share your thoughts with me down in the comments section. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe while you're at it.